He looked directly at the camera. His face was swollen, one eye barely open, his lip split. His hair shaved rough and uneven across the left side of his scalp. And he smiled. Not a smile of surrender, something else entirely. A smile that said, "You are not going to get what you came for." The North Vietnamese film crew had been setting up the shot for an hour. The lighting, the angle, the script. A signed confession from the highest-ranking naval officer in American captivity. A moment of weakness, filmed, ready to be broadcast to the world. What they got instead was a man who had beaten his own face against a concrete floor before they came to take him. He had made himself unfilmable. His name was James Bond Stockdale. Not a code name, not a coincidence, simply the name his parents gave him. He was a Navy captain, a combat pilot, a scholar of ancient philosophy, and for 7.5 years, the most dangerous man in a North Vietnamese prison. Not because of his rank, not because of his physical strength. The guards had taken that from him through methods too specific to detail in the first minute of this story. Because of what was inside his head. And because of something he built with his knuckles, tapping against a concrete wall. Let's go back to September 9th, 1965. The Gulf of Tonkin. The carrier USS Oriskany, Stockdale, was 41 years old. He had been flying combat missions for 6 weeks, his 201st sortie over North Vietnam. His aircraft? An A-4 Skyhawk, light, fast, designed for close air support. On that morning, over the town of Tan Hoa, a surface-to-air projectile found his aircraft. He had just enough time to eject. He descended under the parachute canopy into a rice paddy, and before he could get to his feet, the villagers reached him. What happened in those first minutes on the ground is documented in the accounts of other prisoners who heard it described in whispers, tapped through walls over the following years. A leg broken in the ejection. A shoulder wrenched from its socket on impact. And then, the villagers, who had been living under American bombing strikes for weeks, who had lost people, who were afraid and furious, they found him in the paddy, and they took out what they had endured. He was pulled through the town, beaten, then loaded into a truck and driven north. To Hanoi, to a facility the prisoners had already given a name in private, the Hanoi Hilton. Its actual designation was Hoa Lo Prison, built by the French in the 1890s to hold Vietnamese political prisoners. Now repurposed, adapted, used to hold American aviators. The first thing Stockdale heard when they brought him through the gates was a familiar sound. Tapping. Faint, rhythmic, coming from the walls. He didn't understand it yet, but he would. The tap code was not Stockdale's invention. That distinction belongs to a man named Carlisle Smitty Harris, a pilot shot down the previous spring, one of the first Americans taken to Hoa Lo. Harris had remembered something from a class at survival school. A grid. 25 letters arranged in a 5x5 square, with C and K sharing a cell. Each letter located by 2 numbers, row and column. 2 taps, pause, 3 taps. That was the letter H. 5 taps, 3 taps. That was X. It sounds slow, and it was at first. A trained prisoner could eventually move at about the pace of a slow conversation, 20 words a minute if conditions were right, if the guards were at the far end of the corridor, if the walls were thin enough. Harris passed it to the next prisoner. That prisoner passed it to the next. By the time Stockdale arrived, it had already moved through a significant portion of the population. What happens to men in solitary confinement? What does isolation actually do? The research, most of it conducted decades after the war, partly because of what these men experienced, is specific. After a few days without human contact, the brain begins to create contact on its own. Sounds become voices. Patterns become messages. The perceptual system, deprived of social input, starts generating it. After 2 weeks, cognitive function begins to degrade in ways that are measurable and consistent. Memory formation is impaired. Emotional regulation becomes unreliable. The sense of time distorts. Hours feel like days. Days feel like weeks. After months, the degradation becomes harder to reverse. The North Vietnamese knew this. Isolation was not a side effect of captivity. It was a tool. Deliberate, calibrated. And the tap code was the only thing standing against it. Stockdale understood this immediately. Not as a concept. As a physical fact, he could feel the difference in his own thinking on the days when contact came through the wall and the days when it didn't. The tap code kept men sane. It kept them coordinated. And it allowed something that the North Vietnamese had not anticipated and could not fully stop, no matter how many times they found it and punished it. It allowed the prisoners to function as a unit. Stockdale had been a senior officer on the USS Oriskany. He was the highest-ranking naval officer in the prison. In the American military tradition, rank doesn't disappear because you've been captured. The chain of command follows you into captivity. The senior officer is the senior officer. This created a problem that the North Vietnamese did not fully appreciate until it was too late to solve. A group of isolated individuals is manageable. You can break them one by one. You can work on them separately, apply pressure in rotation, keep them off balance, prevent coordination. A unit with a chain of command, even one tapping on prison walls, is something different entirely. Stockdale began issuing orders, not through guards, not through any channel the North Vietnamese provided, through the walls. His directives were simple. Don't give them names. Don't give them military information. Resist giving them anything of propaganda value. If you break, and some men did under conditions that would break most human beings, come back. Acknowledge it through the wall. The unit forgives you. Start again. That last part mattered more than it might sound. A system that only rewards perfect performance and punishes failure creates men who hide their failures. Stockdale's system created something different. Men who came back after failing, because the cost of coming back was lower than the cost of staying broken. He had studied enough philosophy at Stanford to know that this distinction between a system that demands perfection and one that demands return is the difference between a code that survives and one that collapses under real-world pressure. He was applying Epictetus in a cell in Hanoi, and it was working. The North Vietnamese noticed when the prisoners began refusing certain demands in coordinated patterns, when men in different sections of the prison who had supposedly never communicated produced the same resistance, the guards started looking for the mechanism. They found it, sometimes. A prisoner caught tapping was taken to interrogation. The punishment was specific and severe, and the accounts left by survivors are detailed enough that describing them here serves no purpose beyond establishing the fact. They knew the cost, and they kept doing it. Stockdale was caught more than once. Each time, the network went quiet for a period, then came back. Because Stockdale had built something that didn't depend on any single node. If one section of the prison went silent, the rest maintained the code. If Stockdale himself was in isolation, which happened for long stretches, 4 years of it in total, someone else held the authority until he returned. This is not the behavior of a man simply surviving. This is the behavior of a commander running an operation. Let's go back to the camera crew. Because that moment, Stockdale, looking into the lens with a face he had deliberately made unfilmable, is the center of this story in a way that deserves more examination. The North Vietnamese propaganda program was sophisticated. It had produced results with other prisoners, men who were good men, strong men, who under sufficient pressure had read prepared statements on film. Some of those films were broadcast, some reached American audiences. The psychological mechanism behind this was not simply physical coercion. The North Vietnamese had studied their subject. They understood that isolation and time created a specific kind of susceptibility. That a man kept long enough in conditions of dependency becomes, over time, oriented toward the people who control his food and light and pain levels. Not because he agrees with them, not because he has been converted to their ideology, but because the human nervous system is not built for sustained opposition. It is built to find some form of accommodation with its environment, because accommodation means survival. The propaganda teams were looking for the moment when that accommodation was complete enough to produce usable footage. For most prisoners, that moment came Stockdale's strategy, when he learned through the network that his turn was approaching, was not to resist the accommodation. He couldn't. Not entirely. He had been broken before, and he would be broken again. He was honest about this in everything he wrote. His strategy was to destroy the product. If the footage was unusable, the North Vietnamese had nothing. The accommodation could happen. He couldn't always prevent that, but the result of the accommodation would be worthless to them. A swollen face, a split lip, rough patches on the scalp. The footage, when the crew reviewed it, was not usable. This is not heroism in the conventional sense. Conventional heroism involves overcoming your fear and doing the difficult thing. What Stockdale did in those moments was something different. A kind of strategic thinking that operated in conditions where most strategic thinking collapses. He was in pain. He was isolated. He had been systematically deprived of the physical and psychological resources that support clear reasoning. And he was still doing cost-benefit analysis. The cost of what he did to himself, immediate and specific. The cost of a usable film, distributed, lasting, incalculable in its effect on the men still in those cells, on families watching the news, on American public opinion. He chose the immediate and specific cost. Every time. Years after his release, James Stockdale introduced a concept to business literature and leadership thinking that he had not learned from any book. It has come to be called the Stockdale paradox. The writer Jim Collins popularized the term in his book Good to Great, published in 2001, after a long interview with Stockdale. Collins asked him, "Who didn't make it out?" Meaning, among the men who were broken beyond repair, who didn't survive? Who couldn't reintegrate? Was there a pattern? Was there a type? Stockdale's answer was immediate. The optimists. Collins was surprised. He asked him to explain. Stockdale said, "The optimists were the ones who believed it would be over by Christmas. Then Christmas came and went. So they believed it would be over by Easter. Then Easter came and went, and they died of a broken heart. What this means, and Stockdale was precise about the formulation, is that there is a difference between faith and optimism. Faith is the belief that you will survive. Optimism is the belief that the situation will improve on a specific timeline. Faith can be sustained indefinitely because it is not attached to a date. Optimism, attached to a date that passes without resolution, becomes a mechanism for despair. The Stockdale paradox is this: you must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end, which you can never afford to lose, with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they might be. Hold both things simultaneously. Believe you will survive. Accept what is actually in front of you. He had not read a management book to learn this. He had learned it in a 3x9 cell over the course of years, watching men break on the dates they had picked for their own liberation. Collins asked him, "How did you hold on?" Stockdale said, "I never doubted not only that I would get out, but also that I would prevail in the end and turn the experience into the defining event of my life, which, in retrospect, I would not trade." He was not being sentimental, he was being specific. The experience was the defining event, not the war, not the medals, not the philosophy lectures. Those years. What he built in that time, the network, the code, the system of return and forgiveness, the daily practice of the dichotomy of control in conditions that tested it to the limit. That was not something he lost when he walked out of Hoa Lo. That was what he was. There are men still alive who tapped on those walls. They are in their 80s now mostly. Some are 90 or older. The youngest of the Vietnam prisoners of war were in their early 20s when they were captured. Born in the early 1940s, they are approaching, or past, the end of ordinary lifespans. Some of them give interviews, some don't. Some have talked about those years every year since they got home. Some talked once and never again. What they agree on, the point of convergence in all the accounts I've read, from men who remember those years very differently in terms of their personal experience, is the tap code. They describe the sound of it the same way, across accounts that were produced independently, decades apart. The first time you heard it, you didn't know what it was. Then you figured it out. Then you tapped back. And something changed in the quality of the silence. Not because the information transferred was important. The first exchanges were often simple. "Are you there?" "Yes." "What's your name?" The basic inventory of not being alone. But because the silence after a tap that had been answered was different from the silence before. The silence before was solitary. The silence after was not. The Naval War College. After his release and recovery, a process that took considerably longer than official timelines suggested, though Stockdale was characteristically understated about this, he was appointed president of the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. He was there from 1977 to 1979. In that role, he did something that was not typical of institution presidents in any field. He made the study of philosophy mandatory. Not military history, not strategic theory in the conventional sense, philosophy. The ancient texts, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, Thucydides. The recorded arguments of people who had thought carefully about what human beings owe each other, what power is, what duty requires, what the self actually consists of. His reasoning was direct. Officers who had not thought carefully about those questions would, in the field, make decisions based on assumption, habit, and institutional pressure. Officers who had thought carefully about them would, in the field, have something to fall back on when the situation exceeded the capabilities of assumption, habit, and institutional pressure. He knew what it looked like when the situation exceeded those capabilities. He had been there for the full stretch of it. One detail that appears in the accounts of men who knew him at the Naval War College. He tapped. Not on walls, there was no occasion for that, but on desks, on tables, on the armrests of chairs, absent-mindedly during meetings and lectures and conversations. 2 taps, pause, 3 taps, pause, 4 taps, pause, 1 tap. The men who had been prisoners recognized it immediately. The men who hadn't been prisoners assumed it was a nervous habit. It wasn't, exactly. It was more that the code had become part of how he processed things. 7.5 years of thinking in taps doesn't entirely disappear when the walls come down. The grid was still there, behind everything. The way a language learned early enough becomes part of the structure of the mind, rather than an overlay on top of it. He tapped. Somewhere in that tapping, probably, was something he was working out, some argument he was refining, some problem he was taking apart in the way Epictetus had taught him. What is mine here? What is not mine? What do I actually control? James Stockdale spent those years learning something that most people will never need to know, and that some people need desperately. He wrote it down. He gave lectures. He tapped on desks in meetings for the rest of his life. And the men who had been in those cells with him, on the other side of those walls, through those drains, in those 3x9 rooms with the light always on, they heard it, and they understood. Let's go back to 1967. Alcatraz. That was the name the prisoners gave to the facility where the North Vietnamese sent the 11 men they had identified as the core of the resistance network. Not the Hanoi Hilton, not Hoa Lo. A separate building, behind the North Vietnamese Ministry of National Defense, a mile away. Smaller cells, 3 feet by 9 feet. Concrete walls, no windows. The light on around the clock, a bare bulb that gave no information about time of day. Leg irons locked every night. The 11 men sent to Alcatraz in October of 1967 were not there by accident. The North Vietnamese had done their analysis. They had identified the leaders. They had decided to remove them from the general population, to cut off the network at its source, to isolate the source of the resistance and starve it of contact. Stockdale was on the list. So was Jeremiah Denton, Sam Johnson, Howard Rutledge, George Coker, 8 others. They were placed in separate cells. No war contact between them. The guards checked constantly. No common exercise periods. No communication at all, as far as the North Vietnamese were concerned. What the North Vietnamese had not accounted for was the drain. A drain running along the base of the exterior wall of the building. During the hours when the guards were at the far end of their route, a man, pressed flat against the floor, could reach his hand to the drain grate and tap on the metal. It took 2 weeks to re-establish the network. Through a drain. Here is what the North Vietnamese wanted from Stockdale specifically. Not just information, not military intelligence. They understood, as professional interrogators, that information extracted under duress is unreliable and time-sensitive. What they wanted from the senior American officer was something more valuable. His face, on film, reading a statement. The propaganda value of the highest-ranking American naval prisoner publicly confessing to war crimes, publicly condemning the American war effort, publicly calling on other pilots to stop flying. This would be broadcast internationally. It would reach American living rooms. It would appear in newspapers in Europe, in Asia, in South America. They had obtained such statements from other prisoners. Under sufficient pressure, most men signed something. Stockdale had signed things too, under conditions he described later with clinical precision in his memoir. He had given them words when they took enough of him to force words out. He was honest about this. He never claimed to be the only man who resisted everything. What he claimed, what the record supports, is that he also did something about it. He understood that a filmed statement was categorically different from a written one. A written confession under duress could be explained, challenged, contextualized. A film of a man reading a prepared statement, looking composed, looking unhurt, that was a different instrument entirely. That could be edited, duplicated, broadcast on a loop. He was not going to give them a usable film. And so, when he received intelligence through the network, tapped through walls over the course of days, assembled piece by piece from different sources, that a camera crew was coming to his section, he made a decision. He found a wooden stool. He used it on himself. His face, when the camera crew arrived, was not usable footage. The swelling around one eye, the split in his lip, the rough patches where skin had been removed on contact with concrete. He smiled at the camera. They took him back to interrogation. The punishment that followed was recorded in his Medal of Honor citation in language that does not leave much to the imagination. He had calculated that the punishment was worth the outcome. No film. The year 1969 was the worst year at Hoa Lo. The North Vietnamese had decided, for reasons that were partly political and partly practical, to intensify the pressure on the entire prisoner population simultaneously. The practice became known among the prisoners as the Purge. Guards moved through the prisons systematically. Each prisoner was extracted, subjected to specific coercive methods, and required to produce either a new statement or confirmation of an existing one. Stockdale was in the middle of this when he made a second decision that the Medal of Honor citation describes, but that the dry language of official commendation doesn't quite capture. He concluded that if he were killed during the purge, which was a genuine possibility, the pressure having become extreme enough that the distinction between breaking a man and killing him was narrow, the network would survive. Other men knew the code. Other men held the chain of command. He also concluded that if he were used successfully for propaganda during the purge, the network would be damaged in ways that could not be repaired. The senior officer's face on an international broadcast condemning the American effort, that would do something to the men in those cells that no amount of wall tapping could undo. So, he attempted something different. Not a cosmetic act of defiance before a camera, but a final and permanent removal of himself as a propaganda asset. Using a razor blade that had been kept hidden in his cell for months, the specific details of its concealment described in survivor accounts, he tried to make himself permanently unfilmable. The guards found him before he succeeded in killing himself. They stopped the bleeding. They took him to the medical section. and they changed their approach. Not because they had become more humane, because they had realized that the man in that cell was more valuable to them alive and broken than dead and martyred. A dead senior American officer was a propaganda problem. A live one, eventually, might still be useful. He survived because he was too valuable to lose. And he used the months of recovery to rebuild the network again, from scratch, through whatever channel was available. How do you explain that duration to someone who has never experienced even 7 days in a place with no windows? Stockdale tried to answer this question for the rest of his life. And the honest answer he kept returning to was, you don't entirely. You give people pieces and let them assemble something approximate. Here are some pieces. The light in the cells at Alcatraz never changed. The same bare bulb around the clock. After a certain number of weeks, the human system begins to lose its calibration. Sleep happens in fragments whenever exhaustion wins. The sense of a day, of morning and evening, of time moving forward, starts to dissolve. The leg irons applied every night made sleep a specific kind of misery. The metal was not padded. The position it imposed on the body was not neutral. Food was delivered twice a day. The content changed seasonally, but was never adequate. The prisoners tracked their own physical deterioration through things like the loosening of a watch band, the increased visibility of the structures of their hands. 4 years of this, for Stockdale, were in complete solitary confinement. The signal reached him during the periods when it could. During the periods when it couldn't, he did something that he had been preparing for without knowing it since his graduate studies at Stanford. He went inside his head and found what was there. What was there, specifically, was Epictetus, a Greek philosopher. Born a slave in the 1st century, never owned property, never held power, spent his life in physical limitation. Wrote nothing himself. His teaching was recorded by a student named Arian in a text called The Discourses. Epictetus had one central argument that he made in approximately 100 different ways across that text. The argument was this: there are things in your control, and there are things not in your control. Your opinions, your impulses, your decisions, these are yours. The condition of your body, the actions of other people, the behavior of the world, these are not yours. The man who tries to control what he cannot control will suffer constantly. The man who focuses exclusively on what he can control will find, in even the most extreme circumstances, a space in which he is free. In a 3x9 concrete cell with the light always on and leg irons every night, Stockdale found that this was not an abstraction. It was operational. He could not control the light. He could not control the irons. He could not control the guards, the interrogations, the length of his captivity, the progress of the war outside the walls. He could control his responses, his decisions, what he refused to give, what he chose to tap through the walls when tapping was possible. That distinction, what is mine and what is not mine, was the line he drew around himself every day. It was the line the guards could not cross, no matter what they did to what was on the outside of it. His wife's name was Sybil. While James Stockdale was learning to communicate through prison walls with his knuckles, Sybil Stockdale was fighting a different kind of war from their home in Coronado, California. The United States government, in the early years of the prisoner of war situation, had pursued a policy of silence. The reasoning was that public attention on the prisoners would put them at greater risk, that the North Vietnamese would use their captivity for more leverage if it became a major international issue. The families of prisoners were advised to say nothing publicly. Sybil Stockdale thought this was wrong. Not immediately. She followed the guidance for years, writing letters that she had no certainty were ever received, maintaining a household and raising 4 sons on the publicly maintained assumption that her husband was alive somewhere and that silence was the correct response. By 1967, she had concluded that the policy of silence was killing men. She began organizing. She connected with other wives, women in the same situation, in the same uncertain holding pattern, receiving no information and producing no public pressure. She helped found what became the National League of Families of American Prisoners and Missing in Southeast Asia. She went to Paris, to members of the foreign press, to anyone who would listen. She said, "These men exist. They are being held. The world should know." The strategy worked. Slowly, imperfectly, but international attention changed the calculus of the North Vietnamese in ways that the policy of silence had not. The men at Alcatraz were eventually returned to the main prison population in December of 1969. The worst of the systematic pressure eased, not entirely, but measurably, in the months that followed. Stockdale believed, to the end of his life, that Sybil's campaign had changed the conditions of his captivity. He also believed that the tap code, the network, the chain of command, the organized resistance, had kept the men functional long enough for that campaign to have someone to save. 2 operations, one inside the walls, one outside. Neither one sufficient without the other. February 12, 1973. Operation Homecoming. The Paris Peace Accords had been signed on January 27th. The agreement included the return of American prisoners of war within 60 days. 60 days. For the men at Hoa Lo, that 60-day clock began with a piece of information tapped through the walls. "It's over. We're going home." Some of them had been in that building for 8 years. Some had arrived as young men in their mid-20s and were now in their early 30s, with physical damage that no 60 days of repatriation could reverse. Some had not made it. Ronald Stores, one of the 11 sent to Alcatraz, had died in captivity in 1970. The circumstances of his death were not fully documented until years later. The ones who were leaving did so in the order the North Vietnamese specified, which was not the order of rank. Stockdale departed on February 12th with a group of other senior officers. He was 49 years old. He had gone in at 41. His leg, broken in the ejection and never properly set, had been re-broken by his captors at some point, and had healed again in a configuration that would require surgery and would affect his movement permanently. His shoulders, wrenched out in the first weeks, had their own long history. His back had been broken, his hearing had been affected. When he walked onto the American transport aircraft, walked under his own power, which he insisted on, the crew of the aircraft saw a man who had been through something they had no framework to measure. He was, by multiple accounts of the men who were there, completely composed. The Medal of Honor was presented by President Gerald Ford on March 4, 1976. The citation is a compressed document. Official language tends to compress things. It describes covert communication attempts, self-disfiguration to prevent propaganda exploitation, continued resistance under torture, and leadership of the prisoner organization across 7.5 years. What it cannot quite describe, what official language by its nature cannot fully hold, is the texture of what it means to maintain a command structure through concrete walls, using a code built on a 5x5 grid of letters across nearly 3,000 days, while being systematically worked on by people who were very good at their work. Stockdale received 26 combat medals and awards in total, 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 4 Silver Stars, 2 Purple Hearts, 3 Distinguished Service Medals. He had also flown 201 combat missions before his aircraft was hit over Tan Hoa. He was a pilot who became a commander, who became something that the military's system of commendation was built for, but still struggled to fully express. What does a man do with that much time? This is not a rhetorical question. Stockdale spent considerable time thinking about it and wrote the answer down. He led the Naval War College, then the Citadel. He held a fellowship at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. He became a scholar in the literal sense of the word. Someone who does the reading, works through the arguments, writes about the conclusions. His books are not what you might expect from a decorated combat officer. They are books about Epictetus, about Stoic philosophy, about the relationship between ancient thought and modern experience. The titles tell you something. A Vietnam Experience, Courage Under Fire, Thoughts of a Philosophical Fighter Pilot. He was not trying to dramatize what happened to him. He was trying to understand it, to give other people the tools he had found in that cell, in the hope that they might be useful before someone needed them in extremis. He had a lecture he gave for years after the war at military academies and universities and any place that would have him. The lecture was about Epictetus, about the dichotomy of control, about what is yours and what is not. He would ask his audience, "What do you think is in your control?" And then he would work through the answer the way Epictetus worked through it, carefully, precisely, without sentiment. Your body is not fully in your control. Illness, injury, aging, these happen to it. Your reputation is not in your control. Other people decide what they think of you. Your career is not in your control. Events intervene. What is in your control is smaller than most people assume, and more powerful than most people believe. Your judgments, your intentions, your responses, what you choose to do with what happens to you. That's the list. He knew, better than almost anyone alive, that the list was sufficient. In 1992, James Stockdale agreed to be Ross Perot's running mate in a third-party presidential campaign. If you know this story, and many Americans of a certain age do, you probably know it from a single moment in the vice presidential debate of October 13, 1992. Stockdale appeared on stage and opened with a question. Who am I? Why am I here? The audience laughed. The press laughed. Saturday Night Live built a sketch around it. It became, for a season, shorthand for confusion and age, and a kind of endearing cluelessness. Here is what you should know about that moment. Stockdale had asked those two questions, who am I, why am I here, every day in that cell. not as existential comedy, as the foundation of his resistance. He knew precisely who he was. He knew precisely why he was there. When every other certainty was stripped away, those two answers were what remained. He brought them to the debate because they were real to him, because the idea that an American public figure could walk into any room and not have answered those questions seemed to him like the real joke. The sketch ran. The pundits wrote their pieces. He went home to Coronado, and by multiple accounts of people who knew him, he was not particularly bothered. What did they expect him to be? He had tapped coordinates through a concrete wall for 7 years. He had beaten his own face against a floor to prevent a propaganda film. He had organized 11 men through a drain. He had read Epictetus in a windowless cell with a bare bulb and no clock, and found that the arguments held. A television debate was not going to change what he knew about himself. James Stockdale died on July 5, 2005. Alzheimer's disease. He was 81 years old. He died at his home in Coronado, California, the same city where Sybil had organized the campaign that changed the conditions of his captivity, where he had returned in 1973, where he had written his books and given his lectures. The Navy issued a statement. The President issued a statement. Various military associations and academic institutions published tributes. They described his medals, his service, his courage. The things official language is built to describe. What they couldn't fully describe is smaller and more specific. A 5x5 grid of letters. 2 taps, pause, 3 taps. Carlyle Smitty Harris had introduced it. James Stockdale had built an organization around it. Hundreds of men had passed it hand to hand, or rather wall to wall, in the dark. And the thing that code protected, the thing that 11 men sent to a building a mile away from the main prison, with their lights always on and their legs in irons, preserved through a metal drain, was not information, not military intelligence, not anything the North Vietnamese would have found useful. It was the structure of human beings operating as a community. The knowledge that there was someone on the other side of the wall, that you were not alone, that someone was counting, and someone was listening, and someone knew you were there. That is what Stockdale built. That is what the tap code was. The question that Epictetus returned to in the discourses that Stockdale memorized in that cell was this: what is truly yours? Not your body, not your reputation, not the length of your captivity, or the condition of your leg, or the willingness of a camera crew to accept your refusal. Your judgment, your intention, your choice. Stockdale spent 7.5 years demonstrating, under conditions specifically designed to disprove it, that this argument is correct. He came home. He wrote it down. He gave lectures about it for 30 years. He went to a debate and asked who he was and why he was there, and the audience laughed, and he was not particularly bothered. He already knew the answers. There is a man named Everett Alvarez, the first American aviator shot down and captured in North Vietnam in August of 1964, a year before Stockdale arrived. Alvarez spent 8.5 years as a prisoner. He outlasted Stockdale's captivity by 12 months. When Alvarez was asked, years after his release, what he thought of Stockdale's role in the prison network, he said something that has stayed with me since I first read it. He said, It was as if God had a plan for him. I don't know what to do with that sentence theologically, but as a description of a match between a man and a moment, between what James Stockdale had spent his life becoming and what the Hanoi Hilton specifically required, it seems as accurate as anything else. He had studied philosophy at Stanford before his final deployment. A professor there named Philip Rhinelander had handed him the Enchiridion, the handbook of Epictetan thought, and told him to take it seriously. He took it with him when he deployed. When his plane was hit over Tan Hoa and he was falling under his parachute toward the paddy below, he said afterward that he had one clear thought. He was leaving the world of technology and entering the world of Epictetus. He knew what that meant, and he knew what to do. The TAP code grid is simple enough to memorize in an afternoon. A, B, C, D, E across the top row, F, G, H, I, J in the second, L, M, N, O, P in the third, Q, R, S, T, U in the fourth, V, W, X, Y, Z in the fifth. The letter K is absorbed by C. To send a letter, you tap the row number first, pause, then the column number. 1 tap. Pause. 2 taps. That's B. 4 taps. Pause. 3 taps. That's S. It sounds mechanical. On paper, it is mechanical. In practice, in a concrete cell with a guard in the corridor and a leg iron on your ankle and a bare bulb overhead, and the nearest human being you know is on the other side of 4 inches of wall, it sounds like the most important thing you have ever heard. Stockdale tapped it for 7 years. Not every day. Some days the guards were too close. Some days the punishment for the last attempt was still fresh enough to require silence. But enough days that hundreds of men knew they were not alone, knew what the code of conduct was, knew that someone was counting on them and forgiving them and requiring them to come back after they broke, because that was the rule. Come back. That code, that system, that network tapped through walls. It kept a community alive in a place specifically designed to make community impossible. James Stockdale built it. He built it with his knuckles. And then he came home and he wrote it all down, and he gave lectures about Epictetus for 30 years, and he asked who he was and why he was there on national television, and the laughter did not reach whatever he carried home from that prison. He already knew. If you watch this story to the end, write one word in the comments. Tap and tell us what city you're watching from.